The scream came from the meadow just before sunset, sharp enough to make Daniel drop the box he was carrying. He had lived in the house for exactly 6 days, and in those 6 days he had told himself, again and again, that moving to a quiet town like Millhaven would help him breathe again. He was wrong about the quiet part. He ran out the back door, through the tall grass, his heart pounding harder than it had in months, and what he found stopped him cold. A little girl stood alone in the middle of the meadow, arms stretched wide, spinning in slow circles, while hundreds of butterflies rose around her, like a storm of color. She was not screaming in fear. She was laughing, and the sound had simply carried strangely on the evening wind, twisting itself into something that sounded like terror from a distance. Daniel stood frozen at the edge of the grass, his chest still tight, watching her. She looked to be 7 or 8 years old, with dark curls that bounced as she turned, and a dress the color of a robin's egg. She did not seem to notice him at first. She kept talking, her voice light and clear, saying things he could not quite make out, pausing every few seconds as though she were listening to a reply. "Are you all right?" he finally called out, his voice rough. The girl stopped spinning. The butterflies scattered upward in a soft wave, and for a moment, the whole meadow seemed to hold its breath. She turned to look at him, tilting her head the way children do when they are deciding whether a stranger is safe. "I'm fine," she said simply. "I was just talking." "To the butterflies?" She smiled, a small private smile that seemed far too old for her face. "Something like that?" Daniel let out a breath he did not know he had been holding, and managed a tired laugh. "You gave me quite a scare. I thought something had happened to you." "Nothing happened to me," the girl said. "It happened a long time ago, to someone else." He did not understand the comment, and in the confusion of the moment, he let it slide past him, the way people let strange things slide past them when they are tired and want simple answers. He asked her name. "Mela," she said. "I live just past the fence, with my grandmother." "I'm Daniel. I just moved in." He gestured vaguely toward the house behind him, its windows still bare of curtains, boxes stacked in nearly every room. "I didn't realize anyone used this meadow." "Nobody uses it," Mela said, "except me, and them." She nodded toward the empty air where the butterflies had been, as though it were the most natural sentence in the world. Daniel decided, in that moment, that she was simply a child with an active imagination, the kind of girl who gave names to clouds and held tea parties for dolls that could not drink. He found it charming, in a way that reminded him, painfully, of the life he used to imagine having, a life with a child of his own, a life with Claire. He pushed the thought down before it could take hold, and told Mela it was getting late, that she should probably head home before dark. She nodded, said goodbye with a small wave, and walked off through the grass toward a low wooden fence at the far end of the meadow, disappearing behind a line of birch trees. That night, Daniel sat on his back porch with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, staring out at the meadow, where the last of the daylight was fading into a deep blue. The house still smelled of fresh paint and cardboard. He had moved here to escape the apartment, where every room held some invisible trace of Claire, some ghost of a memory he could not walk past without his chest tightening. The doctors had told him, grief takes time. His friends had told him a change of scenery would help, so he had sold the apartment, packed what remained of his life into boxes, and found this small house on the edge of Millhaven, a town he had chosen almost at random from a map, simply because it was far enough from everything he knew. He had not expected a strange, butterfly-loving little girl to be the first genuinely interesting thing that happened to him here. He almost smiled at the thought before exhaustion pulled him inside and up to bed. Over the following days, Daniel noticed Mela in the meadow nearly every afternoon. She would arrive around 4, always alone, and stay until the sun began to dip low. Sometimes she ran through the grass, chasing nothing he could see. Sometimes she sat perfectly still, cross-legged, speaking softly to the empty air in front of her, nodding as though someone were answering. He began watching her from his kitchen window while he unpacked boxes, telling himself it was simple curiosity, the same curiosity anyone might feel watching a neighborhood child at play. But there was something about the way she paused mid-sentence, the way her expression shifted from joy to sudden sadness and back again within seconds, that made the back of his neck prickle in a way he could not quite explain. On the 5th day, he decided to bring her a glass of lemonade. more as an excuse to talk to her again than out of any real hospitality. He walked out to the meadow just as the afternoon heat began to soften. Mila was sitting near a cluster of wildflowers, speaking quietly. "I know you miss her too," she was saying, "but she says it wasn't your fault." Daniel stopped several feet away, glass in hand, unsure whether to interrupt. Mila must have heard his footsteps in the grass, because she turned suddenly, and whatever she had been looking at seemed to vanish along with her attention. "Hi," she said brightly, as though nothing unusual had just happened. "Hi," Daniel said carefully. "I brought you something to drink. It's warm out." "Thank you." She took the glass and drank half of it in one long gulp, the way children do when they have been playing for hours without noticing their own thirst. He sat down a respectful distance away, on a flat stone at the edge of the grass. "Who were you talking to just now?" Mila considered the question for a moment, as though weighing whether he was ready to hear the answer. "A boy," she said finally. "He used to live near here, a long time ago." "Used to?" "He doesn't live anywhere now," she said simply, and took another sip of lemonade, her tone as light as if she were discussing the weather. Daniel felt a small, cold thread work its way down his spine, but he forced a smile, the kind adults use to humor a child's imagination. "That's quite a story." "It's not a story," Mila said, looking at him directly, her dark eyes unusually steady for a child her age. "But I understand why you think it is. Everyone thinks that at first." He wanted to ask what she meant by "at first," but something in her expression made him hesitate, and the moment passed. She finished the lemonade, thanked him again, and went back to watching the meadow, her lips moving in a quiet, private conversation he was no longer part of. Over the next week, Daniel found himself looking forward to the late afternoons more than he wanted to admit. He told himself it was simply nice to have a friendly face nearby, in a town where he otherwise knew no one. He began setting his unpacking schedule around Mila's visits, finishing his work early, so he could sit on the back porch and watch the meadow, sometimes bringing out 2 glasses of lemonade instead of 1. She spoke to him more each day, telling him small, ordinary things about her life, that she lived with her grandmother because her parents worked far away and visited only twice a year, that her grandmother's name was Rosa and she made the best rice pudding in the county, that she loved butterflies because, in her words, they carry things people can't carry themselves. Daniel found that last comment strange enough to remember, but not strange enough to question at the time. Children said odd, poetic things sometimes. He had read that somewhere, in one of the parenting books Claire had bought, before they lost the pregnancy, that broke something quiet and permanent between them. He pushed the memory away again, the way he had learned to do, folding it carefully into the same drawer in his mind, where he kept everything about her. It was on the 10th day, a warm evening with the sky streaked orange and pink, that everything shifted. Mila was sitting near the fence line, tracing patterns in the dirt with a stick, when she looked up at him with an expression far too serious for her small face. "Claire says the coffee mug is fine," she said. "The one with the crack. You don't have to throw it away." Daniel felt the world tilt sideways. He had not told anyone in Millhaven about Claire. Not the woman at the grocery store who had welcomed him to town. Not the mailman. Not a single soul. He had not even told Mila her name. And the mug, a plain white mug with a hairline crack along the handle, the last thing Claire had ever bought before she passed, sitting untouched in a box in his kitchen, that he had not yet unpacked because he could not bring himself to look at it. No one could have known about that. No one. "What did you just say?" His voice came out thinner than he intended. Mila blinked at him, seeming almost surprised by his reaction. "Claire," she repeated slowly, as though he might not have heard correctly the first time. "She's been trying to talk to you since you moved in. She says you keep pretending not to hear." Daniel's hands had gone cold. The lemonade glass slipped slightly in his grip before he caught it. "That's not funny, Mila." "I'm not trying to be funny," she said, and for the first time since he had met her, she looked almost sorry, the playful lightness gone from her voice entirely. "I know it's scary. It was scary for me too, the first time, but she's not trying to frighten you. She just misses you, and she's worried you're not eating enough. She keeps saying that. She says you used to make her eat vegetables and now nobody makes you eat yours." It was such a small, specific human detail, the kind of thing only Claire would have said, the exact rhythm of her old complaints about his diet, that something inside Daniel's chest cracked open before he could stop it. He set the lemonade glass down on the grass with a shaking hand and pressed his palms against his eyes. "How do you know that name?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "How do you know any of this?" Mila was quiet for a long moment, watching him with the patient, careful eyes of someone far older than her years. Around them, the evening light had turned the meadow gold, and somewhere behind her, a single butterfly drifted low over the grass and settled gently on her shoulder, as though waiting for permission to speak. "Because she's standing right there," Mila said softly, and pointed to the empty space just beside him. "She's been standing there this whole time." Daniel did not sleep that night. He sat at his kitchen table with the cracked white mug in front of him, turning it slowly in his hands, listening to every creak of the old house, and wondering, for the first time since Claire's death, whether grief could actually make a person imagine things that were not there, or whether something else entirely had just walked into his life, through a little girl who talked to butterflies in an empty meadow. He did not yet know which possibility frightened him more. Morning came, but it brought no clarity, only a dull, aching exhaustion that sat behind Daniel's eyes like sand. He kept the mug on the table all day, refusing to put it away, refusing also to admit why he could not bring himself to move it. By afternoon, curiosity had beaten out fear, and he found himself walking toward the fence at the edge of the meadow, toward the small house where Mila lived with her grandmother. He told himself he only wanted to understand, that he was not afraid, though his hands were unsteady as he knocked on the weathered front door. The woman who answered was small and sturdy, with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, and sharp, observant eyes that studied him for a long moment before she spoke. "You must be the new neighbor," she said, her accent carrying a warm, rolling lilt. "Rosa, Mila's grandmother." "Daniel," he said, "I'm sorry to bother you. I wanted to ask you something about Mila, if you have a moment." Rosa's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of something like recognition passing behind her eyes. "You'd better come in then," she said, stepping aside to let him through the door. "I take it she's spoken to you about things she shouldn't have." The house smelled of cinnamon and old wood. Rosa led him to a small kitchen table and poured 2 cups of tea, without asking whether he wanted any, setting one in front of him, with the practiced ease of someone used to comforting strangers. "She told me something last night," Daniel said carefully, wrapping his hands around the warm cup. "Something about my wife. Details she could not possibly have known. I need to understand how." Rosa was quiet for a moment, stirring her tea slowly, as though deciding how much of the truth he was ready to hold. "Mila has always been different," she said finally, "since she was very small. When she was 2 years old, she nearly drowned in the creek behind this house. We pulled her out, and she was not breathing for almost 3 minutes. The doctors said it was a miracle she survived without harm, but after that day, she started saying things. Naming people who had died before she was born, describing houses that had burned down decades ago, houses she had never seen, down to the smallest detail. At first we thought it was simply a child's imagination, the way you are thinking right now, but the details were always too precise, too specific to be invention." "You're saying she can actually—" Daniel could not finish the sentence. It felt foolish, even forming the words in his mind. "I'm saying that in this town, most people learned a long time ago not to ask her too many questions," Rosa said, her voice gentle but firm. "Some children are simply born with a door left open that the rest of us keep closed. Mila never asked for this gift. It found her, the way lightning finds the tallest tree in a field. She did not choose it, and she cannot turn it off, not even when she wants to." Daniel sat in silence, turning his cup slowly on the table, watching the steam curl upward. Part of him wanted to dismiss everything Rosa had said as an old woman's superstition, wanted to walk back home and convince himself the coffee mug and the vegetables and Claire's name had all been some strange coincidence, some trick of memory or grief playing games with his mind. But another part of him, the part that had not slept the night before, the part that had sat alone at his kitchen table, listening for a voice that never quite came, knew better. "Does it frighten her?" he asked finally, "this ability?" Rosa's expression softened into something maternal and tired. It used to frighten her terribly. She would wake up crying, saying voices would not let her sleep. It took years for her to learn how to live alongside it, how to let the voices come and go, instead of drowning in them. The butterflies help her. She discovered, quite by accident, that when she is near them, the voices grow softer, easier to understand, easier to release when she is finished listening. I do not know why. Perhaps because butterflies themselves come from something that was once still and closed, and become something that flies free. Perhaps children simply understand things about the world that we have long forgotten. Daniel thought about the meadow, about the way the butterflies had swirled around Mila like a living cloud, and felt something in his chest loosen slightly, the way tension loosens after a long-held breath is finally released. I need to ask you something else, he said quietly, and I need you to be honest with me. Is there any chance she simply overheard something? A neighbor talking? A name mentioned somewhere in town? Anything that could explain what she told me? Rosa shook her head slowly. You have been here 11 days, Daniel. You have spoken to almost no one. I checked, out of concern, when Mila first mentioned you. The grocer said you paid in silence and left. The mail carrier said you barely nodded at him. There has been no opportunity for anyone in this town to learn your late wife's name, let alone the private details of your life together. I am not asking you to believe in anything you are not ready to believe. I am only asking you to consider that some questions do not have simple answers, and that perhaps it is enough, for now, to accept the comfort being offered without needing to fully understand where it comes from. Daniel left Rosa's house an hour later, his mind heavier than when he had arrived, but strangely, his chest lighter. He walked slowly back through the meadow instead of taking the road, letting the tall grass brush against his hands, watching the late afternoon light slant golden through the trees. He found Mila sitting near the same spot as always, a butterfly resting delicately on her knee, its wings opening and closing in slow, patient rhythm. You talked to my grandmother, she said without looking up, as though she had somehow known the moment he arrived. I did, Daniel said, sitting down across from her in the grass. She told you I'm not lying. She told me a lot of things. He hesitated, choosing his next words carefully, aware of how strange this entire conversation would sound to anyone listening from a distance. Mila, if Claire really is here, if she's really trying to talk to me, I need to know why. Why now? Why through you? Mila considered this with the serious, unhurried patience she seemed to bring to everything. I don't always know why people come to me, she said. Sometimes, they just need someone to listen who still can. But with her, I think it's because you stopped listening to yourself a long time ago. She says you carry her sadness instead of your own. She wants you to put hers down. The words landed somewhere deep in Daniel's chest, somewhere he had kept locked since the funeral, since the quiet apartment, since the box of belongings he still could not bring himself to fully unpack. He had spent months grieving the life Claire lost, the future she would never have, and had never once allowed himself to grieve his own loss separately, as though his pain were somehow less important, less deserving of attention. Can you ask her something for me? He said, his voice thick. Mila nodded, closing her eyes gently, her small face going still, and focused in a way that reminded him, uncomfortably, of someone listening very hard to a voice carried on faraway wind. Ask her if she's at peace, Daniel said. A long moment passed. The butterfly on Mila's knee lifted into the air and circled once before landing softly on her open palm. When Mila opened her eyes again, they were wet with tears that did not seem entirely her own. She says she was always at peace, Mila said quietly. It was you who wasn't. She's been waiting for you to be ready to hear that. Daniel sat very still in the grass, the last of the daylight fading gently around them, and for the first time since Claire had died, he allowed himself to cry, without trying to stop it, without feeling as though the sadness needed to be hidden, or managed or carried alone. Mila did not say anything else. She simply sat beside him, holding the butterfly gently in her palm, letting the silence between them fill with something that felt, for the first time in a very long while, like the beginning of healing, rather than the weight of loss. Weeks passed, and Daniel found himself changed in ways he could not fully explain to anyone who had not witnessed what he had witnessed. He slept better. He ate properly again, without needing to be reminded. He unpacked the last of his boxes, including the one holding the cracked white mug, which now sat proudly on the shelf above his kitchen sink, chipped handle and all. He still visited the meadow most afternoons, though his conversations with Mila had shifted from questions about Claire to simpler, gentler things. He taught her how to skip stones across the narrow creek that ran along the edge of the property. She taught him the names of the different butterflies that visited the meadow, rattling off facts about wingspans and migration patterns with the easy confidence of a much older child who had spent countless hours reading about the one thing that made her feel less alone. But one afternoon in early autumn, as the leaves along the birch trees had just begun to turn gold at their edges, Mila arrived at the meadow looking different, quieter. Her usual energy, the light bounce in her step, was gone, replaced by something heavier, something that made Daniel set down the book he had been reading and sit up straighter on the porch steps. "Are you all right?" he asked as she approached. She sat down beside him, without her usual chatter, pulling her knees up to her chest. "There are more of them today," she said quietly. "More than usual. It's loud." "More of who?" Mila hesitated, glancing toward the far end of the meadow, near a cluster of old, half-buried stones that Daniel had always assumed were simply part of the landscaping left behind by whoever owned the property before him. "Do you know what happened here a long time ago?" she asked. Daniel shook his head. "I never asked. I figured it was just an empty field." "It wasn't always empty," Mila said. "There used to be a building here. A long time ago, before either of us was born. My grandmother told me about it once, though she doesn't like to talk about it much. There was a fire. A lot of children were inside when it happened. They didn't get out in time." A chill moved through Daniel that had nothing to do with the cooling autumn air. He looked out at the meadow, at the tall grass swaying gently in the breeze, and tried to picture it as something other than the peaceful place he had come to love. "How many children?" "6, Mila said softly. "My grandmother said the whole town still remembers it, even after all these years. Nobody ever rebuilt on this land. That's why it's just grass now. Nobody wanted to build a house on top of where it happened." Daniel thought of his own home, sitting just beyond the fence line, close enough to the meadow that its shadow stretched across the grass in the late afternoon. "But my house." "Your house was built after, further back from where the building used to stand," Mila said, as though reading the worry forming in his mind. "It's safe. It's just the meadow itself. That's where they still are." "They," Daniel repeated carefully. "The children." Mila nodded, tracing a small circle in the dirt with her finger. "They're not scary," she said. "I know that's probably what you're thinking. But they're not. They're just stuck, in a way. Like they don't fully understand that so much time has passed. Sometimes they think it's still that day. Sometimes they ask me what year it is, and when I tell them, they get very quiet." Daniel felt a wave of sympathy move through him, sharp and unexpected, for children he had never met, who had died decades before he was even born. "Is that why you come here every day? To be with them?" "At first, I didn't understand why the meadow was different from other places," Mila admitted. "I just felt pulled here, the way you feel pulled toward a sound you can't quite place. It wasn't until my grandmother told me the story that I understood why the voices here are always louder than anywhere else in town. This is where they've been waiting the longest." Over the following days, Daniel found himself unable to look at the meadow the same way. Where he had once seen a place of quiet beauty, he now saw a place layered with sorrow, invisible to nearly everyone, except the small girl who visited it faithfully every afternoon, offering the only company its unseen residents had known in decades. He began to research the fire, driving into town to visit the small public library housed in a converted schoolhouse near the town square. The librarian, an older man named Edwin, with round glasses and a slow, careful way of speaking, seemed surprised by the request. "Not many people ask about that anymore," Edwin said, leading him toward a back room filled with boxes of old newspapers and town records. "It happened before my time here, but my mother used to tell me about it. Terrible thing. A boarding house for children whose families couldn't care for them properly. Burned down one winter night. The official report blamed a faulty stove. Though there were always whispers, it could have been prevented if someone had checked on the place more often." Daniel spent the afternoon combing through brittle newspaper clippings, his chest tightening with every photograph, every printed name. 6 children, ranging from 4 to 11 years old. A caretaker who had survived with severe burns and left town shortly after, never to be heard from again. A community that mourned briefly, and then, as communities often do, moved on, leaving the land untouched, out of some unspoken agreement that nothing should ever be built there again. He returned to the meadow that evening with a heavy heart, finding Mila exactly where he expected, sitting quietly among the tall grass as the sun began its slow descent. "I read about the fire," he said, sitting beside her. "I know," Mila said. "They told me you would." Daniel blinked, startled, though he was growing more accustomed to the strange, quiet ways Mila's world operated, worlds folding into each other in ways he still did not fully understand. "Is there anything I can do?" he asked. "For them?" Mila considered the question seriously, the way she considered most things, weighing it carefully before answering. "You could just be kind," she said finally. "That's usually enough. Most people who come here don't even know they're not alone. You knowing, and still choosing to be here, still choosing to care, that matters more than you might think." They sat together in comfortable silence, as the sky deepened into shades of purple and orange, and for the first time, Daniel thought he felt it too, faintly, at the edges of his awareness. Not a voice, not a vision, but a presence, gentle and watchful, drifting through the tall grass, alongside the butterflies, that always seemed to know exactly where to land. He did not fully understand what Mila carried, the weight of a gift she had never asked for, the responsibility of being the only bridge between the living and whatever remained of the dead in this quiet corner of Millhaven. But he understood, sitting there in the fading light, that he wanted to help carry it with her, in whatever small way he could. What he did not yet know was that his quiet involvement in Mila's world was about to become far less private and far more complicated than either of them could have anticipated. It began with a knock at Daniel's door on a cool Saturday morning, 3 days after his visit to the library. He opened it expecting a delivery or perhaps Rosa checking in, but instead found a woman he did not recognize, dressed smartly in a blazer, holding a small recorder and a notebook. "Mr. Foster?" she asked, though it was less a question than a confirmation. "My name is Priya Malhotra. I write for the county paper. I was hoping I might ask you a few questions about your relationship with young Mila Alvarez." Daniel felt his stomach tighten immediately. "How do you know about that?" "Small towns talk," Priya said, offering a polite but probing smile. "Several residents have mentioned that the girl seems to spend a great deal of time at your property, and that some rather unusual claims have been made regarding her, shall we say, abilities. I understand you may have witnessed some of these claims firsthand." Daniel's instinct was immediate and protective. "I don't think that's any of your business, or the newspaper's business," he said, keeping his voice measured despite the sharp edge of alarm rising in his chest. "She's a child. She deserves privacy, not a headline." "I understand your concern," Priya said, not unkindly. "But I should tell you, the story is already circulating whether either of us likes it or not. I'd rather write something accurate and respectful than let rumor and speculation take over entirely. You could help make sure her story is told fairly." Daniel closed the door gently but firmly, telling her he had nothing further to say, and watched through the window as she lingered a moment on the porch before walking back to her car. His hands were shaking slightly as he dialed Rosa's number, which she had given him weeks earlier in case of an emergency. "She's already been by here," Rosa said grimly when he explained what happened. "I sent her away too. But you're right to be worried. This town has a long memory, Daniel, and not always a kind one. There have been whispers about Mila for years, mostly harmless, mostly quiet, but once something like this reaches print, it stops being quiet." Over the following week, the whispers Rosa had warned about seemed to grow louder, spreading through Millhaven with the particular speed that only small-town gossip can achieve. Daniel began noticing the way people looked at him differently at the grocery store, the way conversations quieted slightly when he entered the hardware shop on Main Street. Some looks carried simple curiosity, others carried something closer to suspicion, or fear, as though proximity to whatever Mila could do somehow made him strange as well. Worse, a small but steady trickle of strangers began appearing near the edge of the meadow, drawn by rumor, hoping for a glimpse of the girl who could supposedly speak with the dead. Daniel watched from his porch one afternoon as a middle-aged man in a gray coat stood at the fence line for nearly 20 minutes, simply staring, before finally walking away. "You need to be more careful," Daniel told Mila that evening, unable to keep the worry from his voice. "People are starting to notice. Some of them aren't just curious. Some of them might want to use what you can do." Mila listened with the unusual solemnity she reserved for serious conversations, nodding slowly. My grandmother says the same thing, she admitted. She's already talked about maybe not letting me come to the meadow as much. I don't want that. This is the only place I feel like myself. I know, Daniel said gently. I don't want that either. But I also don't want anyone taking advantage of you, or scaring you, or worse. You're still a child, Mila. You shouldn't have to carry the weight of protecting yourself from grown adults who don't understand boundaries. That weekend, the situation escalated further when a woman Daniel had never seen before appeared at his door in visible distress, clutching a photograph of a young man to her chest, asking desperately if the little girl next door could help her speak to her son, who she explained had passed away just months earlier in an accident. Daniel gently turned her away, explaining as kindly as he could that Mila was not a service to be requested, that she was a child who needed protecting, not a resource to be summoned. But the woman's tearful, desperate eyes stayed with him long after she left, and he understood, with a heaviness settling into his chest, that Mila's gift, however genuine, however gentle in its intentions, had the potential to attract exactly the kind of attention that could overwhelm a young girl entirely unequipped to handle the emotional weight of strangers' grief on top of her own burden. He drove to Rosa's house that evening, finding her sitting on the porch, her expression tired, in a way he had not seen before. "This is getting out of hand," he said, sitting down across from her without waiting for an invitation. "I know," Rosa said quietly. "I've been thinking about sending her to stay with relatives for a while, somewhere quieter, somewhere further away, until this dies down." The suggestion hit Daniel harder than he expected. Would that even help her? Taking her away from the meadow, away from the only place she says she feels like herself? Rosa sighed heavily, rubbing her temples. "I don't know anymore. I've spent years trying to protect her from exactly this kind of attention. Part of me wonders if I've failed simply by staying in one place long enough for word to spread." Daniel thought of Mila sitting quietly among the tall grass, speaking softly to children who had died decades before either of them were born, offering comfort to voices no one else could hear, and felt a fierce, unexpected protectiveness rise in his chest. "Let me help," he said suddenly, surprising himself with the conviction in his own voice. "I don't know exactly how, but I don't want her to lose the one place that brings her peace. Not because of people who don't understand what she carries. Let me figure out a way to shield her from this, at least until things calm down." Rosa studied him for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind her tired eyes. "You care about her a great deal," she observed. "More than most adults bother to care about a strange little girl who talks to butterflies." "She helped me find peace when I thought I'd never feel it again," Daniel said simply. "The least I can do is try to protect the peace she's found for herself." Rosa nodded slowly, a faint, grateful smile touching the corners of her mouth for the first time that evening. "Then we'll figure it out together," she said. "But you should know, Daniel, protecting her may cost you more than you realize. Once you're known as her protector, this town won't let you stand quietly on the sidelines anymore. You'll be part of her story too, whether you're ready for that or not." Daniel did not yet know how true those words would prove to be, nor how quickly the quiet, comforting world he had found in Millhaven's meadow was about to be tested by forces far less gentle than a lonely mother searching for one last conversation with her son. The article appeared in the county paper the following Thursday, tucked on the third page beneath a photograph of the meadow taken from a distance, its headline reading, in careful, deliberately restrained print, "Local child claims unusual gift, town divided on response." Priya Malhotra had kept her word about writing something measured, but measured words did little to slow the reaction that followed. By Friday morning, the trickle of curious strangers near the fence line had become something closer to a steady stream. Cars Daniel did not recognize began parking along the narrow road that ran past his property, their occupants lingering near the meadow with cameras, notebooks, and hopeful, hollow expressions that reminded him uncomfortably of the grieving mother who had come to his door the week before. Rosa made the decision to keep Mila home from the meadow entirely for a few days, a decision Daniel understood but privately worried about, having seen firsthand how much the open space and its quiet company meant to her. He visited the small house behind the fence each afternoon instead, finding Mila restless and pale, curled on the porch swing with a book she was clearly not reading. "I can still hear them," she admitted quietly on the third day of her confinement. "Even from here." It's harder without the butterflies, though. Harder to understand what they're trying to say. It's like trying to listen to someone underwater. I'm sorry, Daniel said, sitting beside her. This isn't fair to you. None of it's really anyone's fault, Mila said, with a maturity that still occasionally startled him. People are just scared of what they don't understand. My grandmother says fear makes people do strange things, even when they don't mean any harm. But not everyone approaching the situation was harmless, and Daniel discovered this firsthand on a gray, overcast afternoon when a sleek black car pulled into his driveway and a well-dressed man stepped out, introducing himself as Victor Callahan, a researcher affiliated with a private organization studying what he described carefully as anomalous psychic phenomena. I'll be direct with you, Mr. Foster, Callahan said, standing on the porch with the confident ease of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. My organization is prepared to offer substantial compensation for controlled access to the girl, structured sessions, professional oversight, proper documentation. We believe her ability could be of significant scientific value, and frankly, significant financial value as well, for her family. Daniel felt something cold and sharp settle in his chest. She's a child, he said flatly, not a laboratory subject. I understand the instinct to protect her, Callahan said smoothly, undeterred. But consider the alternative. Word is already spreading. Others less scrupulous than myself will come looking for her eventually, whether through this channel or another. Wouldn't it be better for her family to control the terms, rather than leave her exposed to whoever shows up next with far less honorable intentions? There was an uncomfortable logic buried in Callahan's words, one that gnawed at Daniel even after he firmly turned the man away, watching the black car disappear down the road with a growing sense of unease settling over him like a shadow. He drove immediately to Rosa's house to warn her, finding her already tense, having received a similar visit from a different representative of the same organization earlier that morning. They're relentless, Rosa said, pacing her small kitchen with unusual agitation. I've dealt with people like this before, years ago, when Mila was much younger and the stories first started. They always frame it as an opportunity. They never frame it as what it actually is. Which is exploitation, Rosa said sharply, dressed up in polite language and expensive suits. That night, unable to sleep, Daniel sat at his kitchen table, turning the cracked white mug slowly in his hands, thinking through everything Rosa had told him, everything Callahan had offered, everything the frightened, grieving strangers outside his window represented. He thought of Claire, of the quiet, gentle way Mila had helped him find peace, without asking for anything in return, and felt a fierce determination settle over him, sharper and more focused than anything he had felt since arriving in Millhaven. He would not allow Mila to become a headline, a research subject, or a commodity for strangers to exploit. Whatever it took, he intended to help Rosa protect her, even if that meant standing directly in the path of people far more powerful and persistent than a single curious journalist. The following morning, he called a meeting at Rosa's house, inviting only the handful of people in Millhaven he had come to trust during his short time there. Edwin the librarian, who had grown fond of Mila over the years, and possessed a quiet, steady influence within the town's small community. A retired school teacher named Margaret who had once taught Mila and remained fiercely protective of her former student, and a young local doctor named Oliver, who had treated Mila for minor childhood ailments and understood, better than most, the difference between genuine gift and calculated fraud. Around Rosa's kitchen table, the small group worked together to form a plan, discussing how to redirect unwanted attention, how to politely but firmly discourage further visits from strangers, and how to present Mila's story to the town, if it needed to be presented at all, in a way that emphasized her humanity rather than her strangeness. She's not a mystery to be solved, Margaret said firmly, echoing the sentiment that had settled over the entire room. She's a little girl who has been given something extraordinary to carry, and it's our responsibility, as the adults around her, to help her carry it safely, rather than let curious strangers turn her into a spectacle. Daniel left the meeting that afternoon with a clearer sense of purpose than he had felt in months, perhaps longer. He was no longer simply a grieving widower who had stumbled into a strange, quiet corner of the world by accident. He had become something else entirely, a protector, bound not by blood but by gratitude and growing affection, standing firmly between a remarkable child and a world not yet ready to understand the delicate, precious nature of what she carried. But even as their plan took shape, none of them could have anticipated how quickly Victor Callahan's organization would escalate their efforts, nor how far they were prepared to go to secure access to a gift they viewed not as sacred, but simply as an asset waiting to be claimed. A week passed with an uneasy quiet, the kind that settles over a town right before a storm breaks. Daniel returned to something resembling routine, walking to the meadow each afternoon, sitting with Mila as she slowly began venturing outside again under Rosa's watchful permission. The crowds of strangers had thinned somewhat, discouraged by Edwin and Margaret's quiet efforts around town, and for a few days, it seemed as though the worst of the disruption had passed. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon, Daniel returned home from a trip into town to find his back door standing slightly open, though he was certain he had locked it that morning. His stomach dropped as he stepped inside cautiously, calling out, though he already sensed the house was empty. Nothing appeared to be missing at first glance, but on his kitchen table sat a plain white envelope that had not been there before, his name typed neatly across the front. Inside was a single sheet of paper, containing a short, unsettling message. "We admire your loyalty, Mr. Foster, but loyalty rarely wins against resources. Reconsider our offer before circumstances change beyond anyone's control." His hands trembled slightly as he read the note twice, understanding immediately who had sent it. He called Rosa immediately, his voice tight with barely controlled alarm, explaining what he had found. She insisted he come over right away, and when he arrived, he found her standing at her front window, watching the road with an expression of quiet, controlled fear that unsettled him more than any outward panic could have. "They've been watching the house," Rosa said grimly. "I found footprints near Mila's window this morning. I didn't want to frighten her, so I said nothing. But I've asked Oliver to stay with us tonight, just in case." "We need to involve the police," Daniel said immediately. "I already tried," Rosa said, frustration creeping into her voice. "They took a report, but without proof of an actual crime, without anything more than a note and some footprints, there's little they can do immediately. These people are careful. They know exactly how far they can push. Without crossing a legal line, the law can easily punish." Daniel felt a familiar, helpless anger rise in his chest, the same anger he had felt watching Claire's illness progress, despite every effort to fight it, the anger of standing powerless against a threat that refused to play by fair or predictable rules. But this time, he refused to let that helplessness paralyze him. "Then we make it harder for them to get close," he said firmly. "We don't wait for the police to act. We act first." Over the following days, the small group that had gathered around Rosa's kitchen table weeks earlier reconvened with renewed urgency, working together to establish a rotating watch around Rosa's property, ensuring Mila was never left alone even for a moment. Oliver arranged for a security camera to be installed near the front entrance, a modest but effective deterrent. Edwin, through his careful, quiet influence around town, spread word discreetly that any strangers seen lingering near the Alvarez property should be reported immediately to a designated contact. Daniel took to sleeping lightly, waking at every unfamiliar sound outside his window, his earlier grief slowly transforming into something sharper and more purposeful, a fierce, protective vigilance he had not known himself capable of since losing Claire. The tension reached its peak on a moonless Friday night, nearly 2 weeks after the threatening note first appeared. Daniel was on watch duty outside Rosa's house, sitting quietly on the porch with a flashlight and a cup of coffee gone cold hours earlier, when he noticed a shadow moving along the tree line at the edge of the property, deliberate and careful in a way that no innocent passerby would move. His heart pounding, he called out sharply, and the shadow froze for a brief moment, before turning and disappearing quickly into the darkness beyond the trees. He gave chase instinctively, adrenaline overriding caution, following the sound of retreating footsteps through the underbrush, until he stumbled upon a small, abandoned bag near the edge of the property, clearly dropped in haste. Inside, he found a professional camera, several printed photographs of Mila taken from a distance over the past few weeks, and a folder containing detailed notes about her daily schedule, her grandmother's habits, and, most disturbingly, a rough sketch of the property layout, including the location of Mila's bedroom window. Shaken but resolute, Daniel brought the bag directly to the local police station that same night, and this time, faced with concrete evidence of surveillance and clear intent, the officers took the matter far more seriously. An investigation was opened immediately, and within days, security around Rosa's property was significantly strengthened with official support, deterring further attempts at intrusion. Victor Callahan's organization, faced with mounting legal risk and unwanted police attention, quietly withdrew from Millhaven entirely within the following week, their black cars disappearing from the narrow roads as suddenly as they had first arrived. But the experience left a lasting mark on everyone involved, particularly Mila, who grew noticeably more cautious in the weeks that followed, her usual open warmth tempered by a wariness that broke Daniel's heart every time he noticed it. "I don't like feeling scared in my own home," she admitted quietly one afternoon, sitting beside him in the meadow, the butterflies noticeably absent that day, as though even they sensed the lingering unease that had settled over the property. "You shouldn't have to feel that way," Daniel said gently, "and I promise, all of us will keep working to make sure you never have to feel that way again." Mila studied him for a long moment, her dark eyes older and more solemn than they had been just weeks earlier. "You've changed since you moved here," she observed softly. "You used to seem so sad, all the time, even when you smiled. You don't seem that way anymore." Daniel considered her words carefully, recognizing the truth in them even as he struggled to fully articulate it. "I think," he said slowly, "protecting something worth protecting has a way of healing a person, even while they're busy trying to heal something else entirely." Mila smiled faintly, the first genuine smile he had seen from her in days, and reached out to take his hand, her small fingers curling trustingly around his. Around them, as though responding to the shift in her mood, a handful of butterflies began drifting slowly back into the meadow, settling gently into the tall grass, as the golden afternoon light stretched long and warm across the quiet, hard-won peace they had fought so carefully to protect. Winter arrived in Millhaven quietly, dusting the meadow with a thin layer of frost that turned the tall grass silver each morning before the sun burned it away. With Callahan's organization gone, and the police investigation providing a sense of renewed security, life around Rosa's house and Daniel's small property gradually settled into something calmer, though never quite as simple as it had been before the article's publication. Word of what had happened, the surveillance, the threatening note, the eventual police involvement, spread through Millhaven with the same speed the original story had, but this time, the town's reaction shifted in a direction Daniel had not anticipated. Rather than fueling further curiosity or suspicion, the ordeal seemed to awaken something protective in many of Millhaven's longtime residents, a quiet, collective decision that whatever Mila carried, she deserved to be shielded from those who sought to exploit it, not exposed further to their advances. Neighbors who had once eyed Mila with wary curiosity began greeting her warmly on the street. The grocer began setting aside her favorite candy without being asked. Margaret organized a small gathering at the town hall, inviting residents to hear, in careful, respectful terms, the truth of Mila's gift and the responsibility the community shared in protecting a child who had never asked for the burden she carried. Not everyone in town fully embraced the shift. A small, vocal minority remained convinced the entire situation was either fabricated or, worse, something unnatural that ought to be avoided rather than accepted. Daniel encountered this resistance directly one afternoon at the hardware store, where an older man named Harold Whitfield cornered him near the paint aisle, his expression tight with barely concealed disapproval. "You ought to be more careful, associating yourself with whatever's happening over there," Harold said, his voice low but pointed. "Whatever that girl's doing, it isn't natural. Folks like you, stirring up more attention isn't doing this town any favors." Daniel met the man's gaze steadily, no longer the uncertain, grieving stranger who had arrived in Millhaven months earlier. "What she's doing," he said calmly, "is offering comfort to people who've lost someone they love, and asking for nothing in return, except to be treated with basic kindness. If that unsettles you, Harold, I'd gently suggest examining why comfort and kindness make you so uncomfortable." Harold had no response to that, and after a long, tense silence, simply turned and walked away, leaving Daniel standing quietly amid cans of paint, surprised by his own steady conviction. Despite occasional resistance, the overall shift in the town's attitude allowed Mila a measure of peace she had not known in years. She returned to the meadow daily, without fear of strangers lingering nearby, her natural warmth and curiosity slowly resurfacing after the tense weeks of Callahan's pursuit. It was during this quieter period that Daniel began noticing something new in Mila's demeanor, a growing sense of purpose, beyond simply managing the voices that came to her unbidden. She began asking Rosa and Daniel thoughtful questions about grief, about how adults processed loss differently than children, about whether it was possible to help someone feel less alone in their sadness even without delivering messages from beyond. "I think," she said one afternoon, watching a butterfly land delicately on a blade of frost-tipped grass, "that maybe part of what I'm supposed to do isn't just listening to them. Maybe it's helping people like you learn how to listen to yourselves again, the way you did with Claire's mug and the vegetables." Daniel considered her words carefully, recognizing the wisdom in them despite her young age. "You might be right," he said. "You didn't just deliver a message from Claire, Mila. You helped me understand what I needed to hear from myself. I think that's a gift too, separate from whatever the voices tell you." Mila smiled at that, clearly pleased by the observation, and from that day forward, her approach to those who sought her out seemed to shift subtly. She began asking visitors, when their grief brought them cautiously to the fence line, not simply what message they hoped to receive, but what they hoped to feel once they received it. Often, the conversations that followed helped people arrive at their own quiet peace, whether or not a specific message from a departed loved one ever fully materialized. Rosa noticed the shift as well, mentioning it to Daniel one evening over tea. "She's growing into this," she said thoughtfully. "Not just surviving it, the way she has for years, but actually growing into something wiser because of it. I worried, for so long, that this gift would only ever be a burden to her. I'm beginning to think it might become something else entirely, if she's allowed the space and safety to grow into it properly." Daniel found himself thinking often, during that quiet winter, about the strange, unlikely path that had brought him to Millhaven. He had arrived seeking distance from grief, expecting nothing more than quiet anonymity in a town chosen almost at random. Instead, he had found purpose, community, and an unexpected, deeply meaningful bond with a remarkable child who had taught him, more effectively than any grief counselor or well-meaning friend ever had, how to release sorrow without abandoning love. He had also, he realized with growing clarity as the winter months passed, found something resembling family again, in Rosa's warm kitchen, in Mila's steady trust, in the small, protective community that had rallied together when it mattered most. It was not the family he had once imagined building with Claire, but it was, in its own unexpected way, no less meaningful, no less worth cherishing. As spring approached and the first hints of green began pushing through the last patches of snow in the meadow, Daniel understood that his time in Millhaven had transformed from a temporary escape into something far more permanent, a life rebuilt, not despite his grief, but through the unexpected connections that grief, strangely enough, had led him toward. What none of them yet knew was that the coming spring would bring its own set of challenges, testing not Mila's safety this time, but the deeper, more complicated question of what her extraordinary gift truly meant, both for her own future and for everyone who had come to depend on the quiet comfort she offered so freely. Spring returned to Millhaven with a gentleness that felt, to Daniel, like a quiet reward after the difficult months that had preceded it. The meadow burst back into color almost overnight, wildflowers pushing eagerly through the thawed earth, and with them came the butterflies, returning in numbers that seemed even greater than the previous year, as though the meadow itself had missed the quiet, steady presence of the girl who visited it so faithfully. With the renewed calm came a new kind of challenge, one that had nothing to do with strangers or exploitation, and everything to do with the simple, universal complexity of growing up. Mila turned 9 that spring, and with the milestone came a subtle but noticeable shift in how she carried her gift. She began, for the first time, expressing exhaustion, a weariness that Daniel recognized immediately as different from ordinary childhood tiredness. "There are so many of them now," she admitted one warm afternoon, sitting listlessly in the grass, instead of moving through it with her usual energy. "Word got out. Even after everything settled down, people still come, quietly, hoping I'll notice them, hoping I'll pass along a message. I don't always have it in me anymore to listen to all of them." Daniel felt a familiar concern tighten in his chest, though this time it was not fear of external threat, but worry for Mila's own well-being, for the emotional toll of carrying so much responsibility at such a young age. He raised the concern with Rosa that evening, who admitted she had been noticing the same exhaustion for weeks. "She's never learned how to say no," Rosa said, worry etched clearly across her tired features. She feels responsible for every voice that reaches her, as though turning any of them away would be some kind of failure on her part. I've tried talking to her about boundaries, but she's stubborn, in the way only a child with too much empathy can be stubborn. Together, they decided it was time to help Mila establish clearer limits, not to diminish her gift, but to protect the young girl who carried it. Oliver, the local doctor, suggested involving a gentle child psychologist he trusted from a nearby town, someone who specialized in helping children process overwhelming emotional experiences, explaining carefully that such guidance need not dismiss or invalidate what Mila experienced, but could instead help her build healthier ways of managing it. The psychologist, a calm, soft-spoken woman named Farah, spent several sessions with Mila over the following weeks, and Daniel noticed, with quiet relief, the gradual changes that followed. Mila began setting aside specific hours in the afternoon, during which she allowed herself to listen and respond to voices, while reserving mornings and evenings for simply being a child, playing, reading, laughing without the weight of unseen responsibility pressing constantly at the edges of her awareness. Farah says it's okay to protect my own peace, even while helping other people find theirs, Mila explained to Daniel one evening, sounding lighter than she had in weeks. She says that doesn't make me selfish, it makes me smart. She's absolutely right, Daniel said warmly, relieved to see the familiar spark returning to Mila's eyes. As the months passed, Mila's newfound boundaries allowed her not only to rest, but also to approach her gift with a clarity and confidence Daniel had not seen in her before. She became more selective about which voices she chose to engage with fully, developing an intuitive sense for which visitors approached her out of genuine, healthy need for closure, and which approached out of something closer to obsession or unhealthy attachment to grief, the kind that no message, however comforting, could ever fully satisfy. For those latter visitors, she learned, with Farah's gentle guidance, how to offer kindness without engagement, how to encourage them gently toward other forms of support, whether therapy, community, or simply time, rather than allowing herself to become their sole source of comfort. Daniel watched this transformation with quiet admiration, recognizing in Mila's growth a wisdom that many adults never fully achieved, the delicate balance between generosity and self-preservation, between offering compassion and protecting one's own capacity to keep offering it sustainably. It was during this period of growth that Daniel found himself, almost without realizing it, settling permanently into Millhaven in a way he had not initially planned. He accepted a part-time position helping Edwin at the library, finding quiet satisfaction in organizing the town's historical records, including, eventually, a small memorial display dedicated to the 6 children lost in the long-ago fire, a project Mila had gently suggested as a way of honoring the voices that had first drawn her to the meadow. The memorial, a simple stone marker placed discreetly at the edge of the meadow, with the children's names engraved beneath a carved image of a butterfly, became a quiet gathering place for the town, a place where grief could be acknowledged openly, rather than hidden away, much the way Mila herself had taught so many, including Daniel, to approach their own sorrow. Standing at the unveiling of the memorial on a warm summer evening, watching Mila place a small bouquet of wildflowers at its base, while dozens of butterflies drifted lazily through the golden evening light, Daniel felt a profound sense of gratitude settle over him. Gratitude not only for the peace he had found regarding Claire, but for the unexpected, remarkable community he had built around a gift that had once seemed, to an outsider, nothing more than a curious little girl talking to insects in an empty field. He did not yet know that the following year would bring its own quiet challenges, testing not Mila's boundaries or her safety, but something far more personal, the question of what her future would hold as she grew older, and whether the gift that had once overwhelmed her would ultimately become the defining purpose of her entire life. Years passed in Millhaven, the way years often do in small towns, quietly and steadily, each season folding gently into the next, until sudden change is measured not in dramatic moments, but in the accumulated weight of ordinary days. Daniel remained in his small house at the edge of the meadow, watching Mila grow from the wide-eyed 8-year-old, who had once startled him with her laughter among the butterflies, into a thoughtful, increasingly self-assured teenager, who carried her extraordinary gift with a grace that continued to impress everyone who knew her. By the time Mila turned 15, her reputation had settled into something far calmer and more respected than the chaotic attention that had once threatened to overwhelm her childhood. Word of her ability still occasionally reached beyond Millhaven's borders, but with Rosa, Daniel, and the wider community's continued protection, and with Mila's own hard-won wisdom about boundaries, she was able to offer her gift on her own terms, helping those who came to her with genuine need, while firmly, kindly turning away those who sought to exploit or sensationalize what she carried. She had grown particularly close, over the years, with families in town who had lost loved ones, offering not dramatic revelations but quiet, gentle comfort during difficult anniversaries or particularly hard days of grief. She never charged for her time, despite occasional offers of payment, insisting instead that comfort should never carry a price, a principle Rosa had instilled in her from the very beginning. Daniel, for his part, had built a full life in Millhaven that extended well beyond his initial role as Mila's neighbor and protector. He had taken over full management of the library from Edwin upon the older man's retirement, expanding the historical archive to include a broader collection documenting the town's quieter, often overlooked histories. He had also begun, tentatively at first and then with growing confidence, dating again, eventually building a warm, comfortable relationship with Farah, the child psychologist who had helped guide Mila through her most difficult years of learning to manage her gift. He had never fully stopped thinking of Claire, nor did he feel any need to. The peace Mila had helped him find in those early weeks in Millhaven had not erased his love for his late wife, but had instead allowed him to carry that love more gently, integrating it into a life that continued moving forward, rather than remaining frozen in grief. One warm evening in early autumn, nearly 7 years after Daniel had first heard Mila's laughter carrying strangely across the meadow, the two of them sat together on the porch of his house, now comfortably familiar and lived in, watching the last of the season's butterflies drift lazily through the golden evening light. "Do you ever wonder what your life would have looked like if you'd never moved here?" Mila asked, now nearly grown, her voice carrying a thoughtful maturity that still occasionally caught Daniel by surprise, even after years of watching her develop into the remarkable young woman she had become. Daniel considered the question seriously, turning his cup of coffee slowly in his hands. "Sometimes," he admitted, "I imagine I would have found my way back to some kind of peace eventually, one way or another, but I don't think it would have been anything like this. I don't think I would have found this sense of purpose, this community, this family, in quite the same way. I used to think my gift was just a burden," Mila said quietly, watching a single butterfly settle onto the porch railing beside her. "Something that made me different in a way that scared people, or made them want to use me. But I don't see it that way anymore. I think it's exactly what you said, all those years ago. It's a way of helping people carry sadness they don't have to carry alone." Daniel smiled, remembering that early conversation clearly, remembering the shock and disbelief he had felt discovering that the strange little girl talking to butterflies in an empty meadow had somehow known his late wife's name, had somehow carried a message that changed the entire trajectory of his grief and his life. "You've become something remarkable, Mila," he said sincerely, "not because of what you can do, but because of how carefully, how wisely, you've learned to do it. That takes more strength than most adults ever develop in a lifetime." Mila smiled, a warm, genuine smile that held none of the wariness or exhaustion that had once shadowed her expression during the difficult months of unwanted attention years earlier. "I couldn't have learned any of that without you," she said, "without my grandmother, without this whole town rallying around me when it mattered most. I used to think I was carrying this gift alone. I understand now that I never really was." As the sun continued its slow descent behind the birch trees lining the meadow, casting long golden shadows across the grass, where 6 children had once, decades earlier, found themselves trapped between one world and the next, Daniel reflected on the strange, winding path that had led him from a place of profound loss to a life rebuilt around purpose, community, and quiet, hard-won peace. He thought of that first evening, startled by what he had mistaken for a scream, discovering instead a little girl laughing among a storm of butterflies, and marveled at how completely that simple misunderstanding had reshaped the entire course of his life. He had arrived in Millhaven believing he was simply escaping grief. He had instead found something far more valuable, a community bound together by compassion, a young girl whose extraordinary gift had taught an entire town the importance of listening carefully to those who carry burdens invisible to everyone else. and a peace with his own loss that he had once believed entirely beyond his reach. The butterflies continued drifting through the meadow as evening settled fully into night, carrying with them, as they always had, whatever quiet messages needed carrying between the living, and whatever remained gently, patiently waiting, just beyond the edge of ordinary sight, waiting not with fear or sorrow, but with the same patient, hopeful grace that Mila herself had carried faithfully throughout every difficult, remarkable year of her extraordinary young life. On a bright June morning, nearly a decade after Daniel first arrived in Millhaven, a moving truck rumbled slowly down the narrow road that ran past the meadow, coming to a stop outside a small house that had stood empty for over a year, its windows dusty, its garden overgrown with weeds. A woman climbed out of the passenger seat, tired lines etched around her eyes, moving with the careful, deliberate slowness of someone who had recently lost something important and had not yet learned how to carry the weight of it. Her name was Priya, though not the same Priya who had once written the article that upended Mila's childhood years earlier. This was a different woman entirely, a young widow named Priya Okafor, who had chosen Millhaven almost at random from a map, seeking distance from a life that had grown unbearably heavy in the city she once called home. She noticed the meadow first, its tall grass swaying gently under the summer breeze, dotted with wildflowers and, unexpectedly, dozens of butterflies rising and falling in slow, graceful waves above the grass. And amid them, she noticed a young woman sitting quietly, her dark curls now longer, her posture calm and grounded, in a way that immediately, inexplicably, caught Priya's attention. Mila, now 22, had grown into her gift, with the same quiet grace she had carried since childhood, choosing to remain in Millhaven after finishing her studies, dedicating her life to gently, carefully helping others find peace with loss, much as she once helped a grieving widower who had mistaken her laughter for a scream so many years before. She noticed Priya almost immediately, sensing the unmistakable weight of fresh grief carried openly, if unknowingly, in the newcomer's posture. She did not approach right away. She had learned, over years of careful practice, patience, and the wisdom of allowing people to come to her only when they were ready. Instead, she simply continued sitting quietly among the butterflies, offering silent, unspoken invitation rather than intrusion. It was 3 days later that Priya finally wandered close to the fence line, separating her new property from the meadow, drawn by something she could not quite explain, some quiet pull she felt whenever she glanced toward the tall grass and the young woman who so often sat peacefully among it. "I'm sorry," Priya said hesitantly, approaching slowly. "I don't mean to intrude. I keep noticing you out here, and I don't know why, but it feels calming, somehow, just watching." Mila smiled warmly, setting aside the book she had been reading. "You're not intruding," she said gently. "I'm Mila. I live just past those birch trees, with my grandmother." "Priya," the woman replied, her voice still carrying the careful hesitance of someone unused to speaking with strangers. "I just moved in. I lost my husband a few months ago. I thought a change of scenery might help, though I'm not entirely sure it has, yet." Mila studied her for a long, thoughtful moment, sensing, with the intuitive clarity she had spent years developing, the presence gently lingering near Priya's shoulder, patient and quiet, waiting for exactly this kind of opening. "Would you like to sit for a while?" Mila asked kindly. "Sometimes it helps just to be near the meadow. It has a way of helping people carry things a little more easily." Priya hesitated only briefly, before settling into the grass beside her, and as the golden afternoon light stretched long and warm across the meadow, Mila began, gently and carefully, the same quiet work she had carried faithfully for so many years, offering comfort not through dramatic revelation, but through patient, compassionate presence, helping a stranger begin the same slow, healing journey that had once, long ago, transformed the life of a grieving man who had simply wandered into her meadow, expecting nothing more than a quiet, uneventful evening. From his porch nearby, now well into his own contentment years after finding unexpected peace in Millhaven, Daniel watched the scene unfold with a warm, familiar sense of recognition, remembering vividly his own first tentative steps into the meadow so many years earlier, remembering the fear and disbelief that had gradually softened into gratitude and quiet wonder. He understood, watching Mila gently guide another grieving stranger toward the same peace she had once offered him, that her gift had never truly been about speaking with the dead. It had always been about helping the living learn how to carry their love forward, gently, without being crushed beneath the weight of what they had lost. The butterflies continued drifting through the meadow as evening approached, carrying, as they always seemed to, whatever quiet messages needed carrying between one heart and another, between grief and healing, between the world of the living and whatever patient, gentle presence remained just beyond the ordinary edges of sight, waiting faithfully, as it always had, for someone ready to finally listen.